now.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk today. I feel as if this subject has been one that has sort of been a long time in the making, and that somehow it sort of found me rather than me finding it. But as a bit of background to it, I'm not surprised that, Steve, you haven't heard of Musette, because very few people have, even in the professional world of early music and amongst people who really do know about this kind of repertoire. This instrument itself is really rare. And that's partly because it wasn't really rediscovered until the 1960s. So it had a very short shelf life of about 100 years as a high art instrument, from about 1670 to 1780-ish. And it was never going to survive the French Revolution because of its very strong associations with royalty, namely Louis XIV and 15th, and generally aristocracy as well. So I wonder if I hold this up, actually, if you can sort of see, this is an example, this is one of my instruments, and it's very similar to the one I'm going to be talking about today. The reason I came to it was that I thought I'd take up a hobby in about 2013, and I always regretted not having learnt Highland pipes at school. I grew up in Aberdeen, and this sat in the back of my mind for decades. And when I thought, oh, I'll take up pipes as a hobby, I thought, oh, I can't really take up Highland pipes because, I live in a semi-detached house. And much as our neighbour says she loves us practicing, I think there's probably a line to be drawn there. And in the meantime, I'd been working in Paris with a French orchestra doing a lot of French Baroque repertoire, and I came across the Musette. And it was partly the repertoire and partly the instrument's unique sound that really drew me to it. And then, so I started learning it. And to cut a long story short, I had to go to Toulouse first to learn it. And then upon the untimely death of my teacher there, I went to Belgium where I did a master's in it. So it became something more than a hobby. And I'd heard about this Musette in the West Highlands Museum. And then I was really very fortunate to be near Fort William on holiday in summer 2021, I think it was. Just as the West Highlands Museum opened again. So it was with great pleasure that I was able to go and see this instrument. So why aren't my slides moving? There we go. I thought we'd start with an introduction to its sound world. This was the clip you're going to see here was a lockdown project where we all got to grips with technology and put this together between the three participants of this. One lives in Derbyshire, obviously there's me in Manchester, and then the harpsichordist was at that time living in Cumbernauld. And we put this together as a lockdown concert, really, a lunchtime concert for Northumbria University. And this just gives you a little flavour of its sound, because I think it really helps to know what the sort of instrument sounds like when I'm describing it. So that was a sarabande from Pièce pour la Musette, which was composed in about 1722 by Jean Hotteterre. And as with most bagpipes, the musette's origins lie in its use as a pastoral instrument. And its transition, as I mentioned, into a high art instrument is really down to its patronage by Louis XIV. Thanks to Louis XIV's patronage, the musette began to feature in various genres of French music, from operas to duets for two musettes and everything in between. And at the same time, there were three dynasties of court-based wind players and makers who turned their attention towards it, the result being the instrument that you saw there. The instrument features in a book called Harmonie Universelle by Mersenne in 1636. And musettes are first mentioned in L'État de la France in 1661. And this is the kind of court circular that tells us, what was happening at Versailles. And it was listed there amongst the instruments of the l'écurie, so the stables, the open air entertainments. But it was also used for chapel and chamber music. These early ones might have been Musette de Poitou, which were a slightly different instrument in that they were mouth blown instead of being bellows blown, as you saw there. And their presence at court predated slightly the bellows blown musette. Now, the instrument in which we're interested today, of course, is this one. And the museum lists its provenance as a set of French bellows pipes purchased at the sale of the Cardinal York's effects in Rome. It was said to have belonged to his brother, Prince Charles Edward. And if we zoom in a bit there's a plaque on the front of the chalumeau there, which reads, Charles Edward Stuart, last Prince of the Royal House of Stuart. And you'll see there on the left a slightly different interpretation of its provenance. So it's taking a little bit of teasing out, and we'll come back to that in a minute. It's all circumstantial evidence. I can't really stress this enough. As a musicologist, of course, we're obsessed with proving things or not. All of the evidence so far, and I am still very early on in this project, but all of the evidence is circumstantial. And I've had already help from members of the 1745 Association, which has been really useful in pointing me towards details that really swing the evidence one way or another. So for a start, Charles's playing of pipes is mentioned in letters from his daughter Charlotte, and also from Louise of Stolberg. And thanks to Deborah Dennison for that pointer. But these letters don't specify which type of pipes. Sir Walter Scott claimed that Charles Edward had several sets of pipes, but he doesn't specify which kind. And he doesn't also say whether he actually played any of them. Scott's name has in fact direct significance in the case of a second musette associated with Charles Edward. And this one is in the collection of the National Museums Scotland. And the one in the National Museum Scotland was the first bagpipe received into the collection. And that one was acquired by a donation from a Mrs. Stuart of Inveresk. And the provenance traces the musette back to Mrs. Stuart's grandfather, Richard Lees of Galashiels, who was a contemporary and acquaintance of Sir Walter Scott. And the musette in the National Museum's collection was bought in Rome at about 1830 at the sale of the effects of Prince Henry Benedict Stuart, Cardinal York, of course. And they were bought there by a Kelso man, who then gave them to Mr. Lees, who was a player of the Irish bagpipe. And this was on the assumption that the musette was an Irish instrument, which is not as far-fetched as it seems, because it's one of its closest modern relatives is in fact the Irish Ellen pipes. And the pipes are described in the records of the Society of Antiquaries, where they sort of briefly stayed, as of the Irish form and mounted with ivory and silver keys. So that set in the National Museum of Scotland would appear to have belonged maybe specifically to Cardinal York, but its association with Henry and of course his brother Charles Edward was good enough to see them become part of the national collection. The pipes were apparently shown to Sir Walter in the 1830s, and he took an interest in the instrument, and said that the bagpipe was an instrument of which the prince, and he doesn't specify which one, of course, was fond, and that he was possessed of several sets. So we have a reiteration of that quote from Sir Walter Scott. Given that Scott had claimed that at least one of the princes had several sets of pipes, there is therefore anecdotal reason to assume that both sets had indeed come from the Jacobite court in Rome, perhaps even Paris, because we don't know their date. I consulted with, many of you will know Hugh Cheap, on the provenance of these sets, and he thinks that both instruments were probably made in Parisian ateliers, of which there were several. And so I've tried to find out from today's makers which atelier it might have been, but apparently they're not instantly recognizable as being by any of the well-known makers. So we're still a bit in the dark as to who exactly made them. So the presence in Scotland of two musettes lends weight to the likelihood that they probably did originate from the Stuart court. And although we can't be sure who played them, there is the final piece of the puzzle that strengthens the connection to Charles Edward of the musette in the West Highlands Museum. Thanks to Edward Cork for pointing this out to me. The Stuart wife referred to, oh, actually, I think I've missed a slide out. This was the donation of the ones to the National Museum, Scotland. So if we go back to the West Highland Museum ones, the Stuart wife referred to there is Rosa, whose maiden name was Fiorani, and the valet de chambre was John Stuart, who started out as Charles Edward's valet de chambre, but he was promoted to be the majordomo of the household in 1768 and made a Jacobite baronet in 1784. And by 1802, his widow and son Carlo were short of money, so they might well have wanted to sell the musette. So given the provenance of the musette in the West Highlands Museum, I began to look into potential archival sources that might reveal something further of Charles Edward's musical prowess and perhaps musical life at court in Rome. Luckily for me, the Stuart papers, which are part of the Royal Collection at Windsor, have been digitalised. And so I was able to gain a month of free access at the beginning of the very first lockdown that we had in March 2020. So I settled down for what I was sure was going to be an interesting read. It was actually, as it turned out, but not in the way that I hoped. After a month of careful scrutiny, I came to the conclusion that there really wasn't any mention of musettes anywhere. Searches of musette, pipes, various spellings of music revealed that mentions of music are frequent in the letters between 1717 and 1719, but thereafter are almost non-existent. Is the implication of this that there are letters or documents missing? Possibly. Or is it simply that 1717, 1719 was a period in which James III enjoyed a lot of music and had the time to write about it? After all, his first child was born in 1720. And I don't know whether you can hear, but I've got small children in the background here, and I can confirm that they are not conducive to writing anything down. So in other words, the archive didn't reveal anything of relevance as far as this project goes. So such is the risk with archival research, of course. But there is another promising archive that I was hoping to be able to discuss with you. But first of all, the pandemic, and then post-pandemic sort of concerts catch up, and the arrival of small children, etc., have rather precluded my ability to visit. But I'm hoping to, in the next few months, visit the Blair's letters, which are currently held by Aberdeen University Library. And they are correspondence between Cardinal York and informers at the Stuart courts. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with it. And as such, they might hopefully reveal something of the musical life at the court in Rome. And one of the surprises has actually been that I haven't been able to find more musicological research about the Stuart court in Rome. I'm familiar with the work of Stefano Baccalo, for example, who's been working on it, and of course, Edward Cork. But beyond that, there's actually very little. So it's a really potentially rewarding area of research to go into and to sort of explore. So outside of these two archives, there is iconographical evidence to support the idea that Charles Edward was known to have some association with the Musette specifically, not just any old pipes. In an article in the 2015 Review of Scottish Culture, Dr. Vivian Williams discussed the cultural implications of 4 works of art, tracing the influence of the portrait seen here, should be on the left of your screens, which is of Gaspard de Guidon by Hyacinthe Rigaud. And this was painted between 1734 and 1735. And Dr. Williams traces the influence of this portrait on 3 other satirical works of art, 2 of which you see here. So the one in the center is a pastel on paper by an artist of the French Royal Circle, Charles-Antoine Coypel. And then the one on the right there is one of a series of prints that's based on Coypel's pastel. And the engraver of this print is Robert Sayre, and the print dates from the 1760s. In 18th century England, of course, as you're aware, the presence of pipes and or tartan was enough to caricature any figure significantly in cultural terms. And to prove that this figure was indeed intended as a caricature, the print was listed in Sayre's catalogue of prints under the section Small Mezzotintos, Droll and Humorous Subjects. So thanks to Williams's work, we have a strong case for Charles Edward's playing of the Musette. And in terms of likelihood, the facts of his upbringing also support the probability that he could have been exposed to the instrument. So that sort of concerns the evidence around the Stuart court. But what about the musical activities of Charles Edward and Henry? We know that they attended the opera frequently in Rome and had opera libretti dedicated to them every season from 1739. Sebastian de Brossa wrote that the young princes both have a passion for music and are very knowledgeable about it. The elder boy plays the cello very well. The younger one sings Italian arias in a lovely little child's voice in the best of taste. However, it seems that perhaps Charles Edward was less fond of music than his younger brother, for James Edgar observed that Prince Charles takes great delight in riding, hunting and other exercises, and the other, besides these, loves music and sings very well. The Duc de Luynes, writing in 1746, confirmed this, saying that both princes are musicians. Prince Charles, he was referring to, plays the harpsichord and the cello. The Duke of York loves music even more than his brother. He accompanied on the harpsichord really quite well. He loves music passionately. Sadly, there is no mention of Charles Edward playing the musette in any of these quotes. However, there is a lovely image of him, described again by James Edgar in November 1742. And James Edgar writes that at night, after a day's strong fatigue, the prince sits down and diverts himself at music for an hour or 2 and plays upon the bass viol very well, for he loves and understands music to a great degree. So we can perhaps imagine Charles Edward maybe also playing his musette during his private evening diversions, and perhaps he played some of the repertoire that was written for the private chamber of Louis XIV or the 15th. And I thought we'd just take a little break here to have a listen to one of these pieces, again to sort of contextualize the sound world that we're thinking about. So this is a piece called La Noce Champêtre by Jean Hotteterre, who was one of the dynasties that I mentioned earlier. And this collection contains pieces that were to accompany the daily life of the king, music to send him to sleep, music to party to, like this piece, and even music to wake him up in the morning. So it's a lovely image to imagine anyone being lulled to sleep or woken up by the musette. Now this video is an amateur video, so you have to excuse the quality, but it gives you an idea. it's just a snippet there. And it's a really sort of vitalizing instrument, isn't it? So unfortunately, the archives of the court of James II and III in France were destroyed in Paris during the Revolution. And further hindrance in piecing together what life was like at the court in Saint-Germain is provided by contemporary accounts that were intended to weaken the Stuart threat by their perceptions of the court as penniless, corrupt, infiltrated by spies. So in other words, they weren't exactly telling the truth. But enough evidence exists to be able to draw some conclusions about musical life at the court at Saint-Germain. As was common in other royal courts, music was part of daily life there. And the Chateau de Saint-Germain contained the finest court theatre in France. And this is where Louis XIV put on Lully's comedy ballet in the 1660s and his tragédie lyrique. So they were really keen areas of scrutiny of the sort of cultural milieu. And some of these works that Lully wrote included Musette, and they were premiered there. So this is a big, important occasion. On the evidence of manuscripts associated with the Jacobite court, it appears that there was a strong Italian influence, but there were also motets by Lully and Couperin. Those by Couperin probably first performed at Saint-Germain. Most of the Sonata da Chiesa, the church sonatas, were Italian, and many were also brought from England. So we get this trail of cultural influence via the pieces that we can trace as having been performed there. We see cantatas and sonatas by Alessandro Scarlatti. They feature heavenly. And then we also get the influence of the exposure of local French composers to this wealth of Italian style. So we see Italian style in the works of Couperin, Sébastien de Brossard, Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, and Jean Ferry's Rebelle. But the story with theatrical music is very different because there's no evidence that the court had any such influence on French composers of music for the theatre. And surviving manuscripts suggest that the ballets and operas performed at Saint-Germain were all French. So that gives us a sort of flavour of what was happening musically speaking and where the influences came from under the court there. So after the unsuccessful invasion of 1715, the Stuart court moved briefly to Avignon, which of course was in papal territory, and then to Rome, where Pope Clement XI offered James, of course, the Palazzo del Re. Now, if manuscripts were brought to Saint-Germain from Whitehall, it seems more than likely that the court's musical library was transferred from Saint-Germain to Rome with them. And therefore, the composers of James's court at Saint-Germain may have provided the soundtrack to the young Charles's early years. Now, James III was a great supporter of Italian opera. And so it's not really surprising, actually, that from 1739 to 43, operas performed during the carnival were dedicated to the young princes. Also during these years, we know that regular concerts were organised by the princes at the Palazzo del Re, in which Charles often played the cello or the bass viol, while Henry was deemed to be the better singer. This is where we get these quotes from. And a household list from 1742 suggests that the man in charge of both the concert and Charles's cello lessons was the cellist and composer Giovanni Costanzi, whose former employment otherwise was with Cardinal Ottoboni, key figure there. After his 13th birthday in 1733, Charles began to enter society, and it's this period between 1733 and 44, when he left for France, of course, that provides us with the most probable window of opportunity for his musette playing. He could have played in his later years, and we know that he did play some kind of pipes, but these are quite physical instruments. And so his declining health makes it sort of more unlikely that he would have played to any great extent in his latter years. So who did write for composers, for Musette? This just gives you a list. It doesn't matter. A lot of these names are very unknown today even. There are some big names like Lully and Rameau, but even amongst musicologists, some of these were unfamiliar to me, despite being a sort of ardent Francophile and musicologist working in this field. But this gives you an idea of the number of works that included Musette. There's a fair few there, and particularly bookended by Lully and Rameau, who were the sort of kings of French Baroque opera. And it's worth noting this because it shows how Musette infiltrated French music making. And its presence it's not restricted to novelty items or chamber music or music for the amateur market, but rather we see it integrated across various genres and markets. So here's a list, and don't worry, this is tiny, and it's a list in progress. A lot of them are just names, some of them even just one name. And this was a list that I started compiling just to get an idea of who had written for the Musette. So these are composers who only wrote one or two pieces for the Musette. And the reason that most of them are just names without even dates is that actually I haven't been able to find out any more about them. So this just goes to show actually how little research has been done around this area. The next group are composers who wrote more than two pieces for Musette, or composed specifically for Musette, or at least named it first. And again, it's a fairly substantial list, most of them completely unknown today. We've heard Bois Mortier is a slightly well-known name, and maybe Hotteterre, but usually only among recorder players. A lot of the others weren't, and yet they were all famous in their own day. So we're talking about key figures here. And I've been unable to find any information regarding the movement or residency of these composers in any other country than France. This isn't to say that they didn't spend time outside of France, though. So the top of the list there, Anne, we know that he studied with Corelli, so he must have left France at some point. And for the most part, these composers their works show that they were influenced by the Italian style, but nearly all of them spent the majority of their working lives in positions at the centre of French music, in the royal household or institutions such as Le Conseil Spirituel. We don't have time to talk about them here in detail, but from each of the following slides, you'll be able to piece together the size and scope of the Musette's repertoire, the scale of which helps to strengthen its position as an instrument of note, which in turn adds to the likelihood of it being played by Charles Edward. So we have Anne. That's a good handful of collections of works there. Corrette, even more. I mean, we know Corrette really primarily today as being the first person to write down how to play the cello. But actually, and his output is not large, but a lot of it contains works for Musette. Lemaire, totally unknown today, but well known during his day. It's interesting to see the Musette used with voices in his works. Bois Mortier is interesting because he was a prolific composer, and so it's not that surprising to see such a large list. But he didn't have a court position. He wasn't reliant at all on private patronage. Instead, he relied on publications of his works. And so the presence of Musette amongst all of his works, or such a large number of his works, showed that there was a buying market for works for this instrument. Because if people hadn't bought the works from Musette, Bois Mortier wouldn't have bothered writing anymore because it wasn't worth his while financially. He was a very astute businessman. Naudot, again, a large number of works. He was key at the court of Versailles. Dupuis, very small output. So again, this is a large percentage of his output. And this is the other Hotteterre, Jacques Le Martin, who is most famous actually for developing the actual instrument itself from a single chanter instrument to a double chanter instrument, but also for writing down how to play it. So this is the sort of the last method or treatise on how to play the Musette. The other dynasty were related to the Hotteterres, and this was Esprit Philippe de Chedeville and his brother Nicolas. And you can see there, again, a sizable list. And within that list, there's quite a variety of genres for which it was written, so chamber music, even concertos, lots of mixtures with other instruments. And his brother Nicolas similarly. What's interesting with these two brothers is that Nicolas' works were very Italianate, whereas his brothers tended to stay more within the sort of French style and form. And I thought we'd just have a listen to a little bit of one of these later works. So we've heard some earlier works, and this is a minuet. So French dance is still very popular, even in the Italianate works. But this is from one of the key composers, printed in the 1740s. So this is getting on in the Musette's life. And this is a period in which Charles Edward may well have been playing the instrument. So these composers all contributed significantly to the Musette's repertoire, and the success of their endeavours really shows that there was a market for Musette amongst Parisian amateurs as well as at the court. This was used by amateurs to fill their concert au salon, their sort of evening soirees. But the Stuart court was in exile in Rome by the time Charles Edward was born. And as I said previously, there's no evidence to support the existence of any of these composers in Rome yet. But the Stuart court in the Palazzo del Re was always open to visitors, of course, and French visitors were particularly welcome. After all, these are the people amongst whom James III had grown up. So it's not surprising to find, for example, that successive French ambassadors to the papal court behaved as though they'd also been sent as ambassadors to the exiled court of the Stuarts. And this being the case, it's perfectly possible that music could have been brought from Paris to the Stuart court in Rome, where it would surely have been given a favourable reception. We know that evening entertainments began to be offered at the Palazzo del Re from December 1736, when Charles Edward was 16. And we know that regular musical evenings were also held at many of the other palazzi, including those of the Ruspoli family and Cardinal Ottoboni, both of whom were intimate friends of the Stuarts. But what was played at these musical evenings? My research into this is still very much in its early stages. And I have been surprised by the lack of scholarly discussion around this topic, but there's a couple of sort of leads that I'm still following up. They must have been documented to some extent, and I think it's partly just getting to know the archives and where the smaller archives maybe in Rome are. So there's still a large amount of work to be done there. I mean, the fact that there were so many concerts at so many palazzi actually muddies the waters a bit. So it helps to know that Rome in some ways functioned in a similar fashion to Paris. Cardinals at the papal court behaved pretty much as aristocrats did at the French court, and most of them were, after all, actually from families of Italian nobility. So popes tended to sponsor arts such as painting, vocal music, and devotional literature. But unlike the French kings, popes didn't sponsor arts that were considered to be more secular. In Paris, the king supported dance and opera, but popes, and most cardinals too, favoured cantatas, oratorios, and instrumental music. Cardinals would often vie with each other with a view to future papal positions, and there was sort of added patronage and offer from foreign ambassadors as they sought to influence politics via culture. And then finally, added into that mix, you've got churches and charitable foundations, which also provided patronage. So in this way, patronage in Rome was actually more varied than in Paris. I've mentioned Corelli already, and until his death in 1713, Corelli was at the heart of most music making in Rome, and it may be that Corelli's influence continued into the 1730s and 40s, but I need to do a bit more research into that period further before being able to draw any firm conclusions. There are several Italian composers with links to the Stuarts: Alessandro Scarlatti, Giovanni Costanzi, who was music master of Charles Edward and his brother, and Niccolò Gemelli, whose patron in life later was Charles Edward's brother, Henry. But annoyingly, none of these composers wrote for Musette. So I've managed to trace the French composers who did write for Musette, but who I can't prove were in Rome. And I've gone through the Italian composers with links to the Stuart court in Rome, but none of them wrote for Musette. So I haven't found the sort of the key component yet. In fact, so far, I've only found one Italian composer who composed for Musette and who may have had links to Rome, and this is Emanuel Barbella. Not much is known about him, but there are enough links to render this avenue worth further pursuit. Most of his works are for violin or violins, but a colleague of mine recently discovered a concerto for Musette by Barbella. And Barbella enjoyed a successful career in Naples, but the exchange of music between Naples and Rome has been long established and must not have been restricted to operas. So it's entirely possible that the works composed in Naples by composers such as Barbella would have been freely available in Rome and known about. And there's another potential link, which is that Barbella almost certainly studied with a highly regarded and very popular teacher, Padre Martini, in Bologna. The exact dates of his study are unknown, but it's possible that he was in Bologna at the same time, or perhaps shortly after the Stuarts. And then in another link, Gemelli was another of Padre Martini's students. Again, we don't know the dates or whether their studies overlapped with each other, but there is at least a possibility that Gemelli at least knew of Barbella, and we know that Gemelli was at the Stuart court in Rome from time to time. So it's not unlikely that Barbella's work could have made its way to the Stuart court in Rome via that link. Now, there's still a lot to do here. To discover what Charles Edward might have played on his musette. I've shown that he could have had access to the latest French repertoire for the instrument, and of course the Stuart court in Rome was still visited by pro-Jacobite young gentry on the Grand Tour, and they might have brought with them their latest musical acquisitions from the tour, or even perhaps from Edinburgh or London. And then we've got Barbella's contribution and potential links. So we've got a fairly wide field of known repertoire from which to choose. And there's still work to be done on pinpointing the opportunities that Charles Edward might have had to play his musette. This being the case, and I realise I've left it rather open-ended there, but in some ways it's a very rewarding project that doesn't give up treasures immediately. And so actually the fact that I've done a fair amount of work on this and so far have not exactly arrived at conclusions, but I've gone through and explored a lot of different sort of routes, actually makes me more hopeful that there will be something, it'll be that pot of gold at the end. And if not, then actually I've learned a lot about music making around the Stuart courts, which will develop into sort of knowledge sharing at some point. So we've got that sort of wide field from which to choose. And I thought I'd just end with an example of chamber music that was written for two instruments, musette and bassoon, by a composer called Colin Charpentier, about whom actually almost nothing is known, except that he was a virtuoso musette player at Versailles. Now, in this instance, what you're going to hear is played by me and my sister, so two siblings. But I thought it'd be quite a nice image to end on if we imagine that this might have been one of the pieces that perhaps Charles and Henry might have played together during one of their soirees, or perhaps as an evening of diversion. So there we have it, some possibilities there. And I think that's where we leave it. So thank you very much for your company.